Hi all, and welcome to the China EVs and More Clubhouse Room, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors that we believe will have effects on the global auto markets. We won't get too technical or wonky, and we'll try to stick with the business strategy and operations side of things. We'll also open up the room for the last 15 or 20 minutes, so if you have any questions, please be early with raising your hand. And one rule we have, we all appreciate vigorous debate, but let's all be considerate and respectful of each other. Briefly, what Lei and I discuss over the next hour or so is based on our opinions and shouldn't be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please follow us on Clubhouse, promote this room to your friends, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I'm the founder of and managing director of Sino Auto Insights. It's a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility markets. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from that you can sign up for on sinoautoinsights.com, which I encourage you all to do. So, Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
Good evening from my side. I'm the former chief editor of China Auto Review. I've spent the last 20 years or so on the ground in China, covering the Chinese auto industry through my own newsletters, magazines, and conferences. I'm now here in the U.S. I'm in Massachusetts on the East Coast, now working as a independent analyst / freelance / consultant. And today we're talking about, well, actually this week is really the busiest week of the year for the Chinese auto industry. It's the week leading up to the Shanghai Auto Show. So we listed some topics at the top of the Clubhouse room. I'll quickly recap what I think are some of the highlights of Q1 sales, and then we'll go into the models that were launched so far this week. So I'll start with a bit of a sales update. I thought the biggest number, I guess, was 500,000 new energy vehicles in Q1. That is a record high for a quarter, for first quarter, actually. And what I thought was interesting is just three players, Tesla, Wuling, BYD, they accounted for roughly 46-47% of March NEV sales. And then you got rest of the, clan. And another statistics I look at closely is percentage of NEV as, percentage of NEVs as overall auto sales. And here's the interesting number. March was 9%. Q1 was 8%. And if you look at the passenger vehicle segment specifically, March was over 11%. And when we talk about Q1, we always talk about, growth, right? Year-on-year growth. But this year, we have to compare versus not only 2020, but 2019. And the interesting thing is auto sales are kind of flat. PV, passenger vehicle sales, are kind of flat. But NEV sales are still growing very strong.
Well, I think it's actually more appropriate to compare it to 2019 because 2020 was COVID time. And really quickly, Lei, I think we should also, for the audience, just let them know Q1 is notoriously a slow time for auto sales in general, even outside of China, because what car companies tend to do is pull in sales from December to get year-end numbers high. It's especially slow in China due to Chinese New Year, which this year fell in the middle of February. So you see a small dip in sales around that February timeframe. So please keep going.
Yeah, exactly. What I see happening is if you look at the trends over the last 5 to 6 years, Q1 is always the lowest of all the 4 quarters. So that likely will happen again this year, the second, third, and fourth. And the fourth quarter is usually the highest during the year. So China's CAAM, which is the official association that announces the official figures, they raised a bit of their forecast on NEV sales to 1.9 million units, but I'm willing to go on a limb and say this year NEV sales will account for 10% of auto sales. And based on the first quarter auto sales, about 6.5 million units, if you simply do, average it out over the year, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm willing to bet that this year NEV sales will top 2.5 million units.
Wow, that's bold.
I'm willing to make that. And here are some of the reasons why.
Are you going to take that to Vegas with you or what? That's a big number.
It's a huge number, but it's not that much. Seriously. Really, if you look at the momentum that's happening in the Chinese market, these smaller EVs represented by the Hongguang Mini EV, the Teslas, right? What we said many times during this show, that the foreign players just have not participated in the NEV market until this year. So, for example, the Volkswagen ID4 in April will be the first full month that they're on the market. So it will be interesting to see how much they get out of it. And just plainly, this is really market-driven. And if you look at the Shanghai Auto Show, if you look at all the new models being launched, right? So far this week, the only non-EV was the Citroen C5X. Everything else was EVs. Audis, the Chinese smart EV startups, the Geelys, the state-owned companies. So I'm willing to bet.
And we'll talk about how that has other implications through the value chain, on dealers and stuff like that, either later in this clubhouse room or a bit further down the line, because they're also looking at new ways to sell these EVs outside of the current dealership model. But I think that 2.5 seems pretty optimistic, because I look at product launches, outside of the ID4, which is going to be shipping in full capacity probably in the next 3 months, or after ramp in the next quarter. But when you talk about Wuling and BYD, their price points are a bit lower than the Tesla. So I think Tesla still has 6 to 9 months of kind of unfettered access to the premium luxury market. And before major competitors come online in September, October, November. And that's if there are no delays in the current production timing or manufacturing timing. And there very well could be because of the chips and stuff, right?
Yes, and here comes my caveat.
Your CYA?
So, yeah, FYI, So the 2.5 million units, I tweeted this out before, it's not going to be a demand problem. So the only bottleneck will come in the production side of it, because of, the chip situation is still moving, and it looks like it will be more affected in the second quarter than the first quarter. So I'm not sure how that's going to develop. But purely from a demand perspective, 2.5 million is not that high of a number. And if you look at the 2025 goal of 20%, I think this year it would be nice to, get close to 10% of sales being NEVs.
Yeah, and one thing that I also want to note is, having worked with planners at manufacturers, I do also know that they're looking at demand in Q1, and then they're scrubbing their forecasts for the next quarter, the entire year, and they're probably increasing demand. And so that puts even more pressure on these chip manufacturers and the suppliers throughout the supply base, because what's happening is not only are they adding volume, but they're pulling in volume, manufacturing volume. So they see this opportunity, and they see this expert Lei Xing saying we're going to get 2.5 million units in 2021. And so they're doing everything they can to scrub, increase that master production schedule, send it out to the suppliers and say, you guys need to fill these orders quickly, and we need you to work overtime in order to fill that pipeline. So there's going to be a ton of pressure on not only chip manufacturers, but battery manufacturers. And that's when we typically see, in a 12 to 18 month period post these demand spikes or these significant demand increases, potential quality issues, right? Because as people are ramping, increasing manufacturing at the supplier side, they sometimes get a bit careless. well, not careless, but not as careful because they're trying to ship product out the door and fill orders. So I think if that is the case, Lei, I would think in the next 24 months, we could see potential software issues proliferating, not only because there's more EVs, but because of this significant increase over 2021 that you're predicting. Because I look at it like 1.92 million units, and I'm actually factoring in some of the supply shortages. But I don't see any hiccups or any hesitation on the demand side. But I do see that, they've been complaining about chip issues for a quarter and a half now. So I think that's going to be lasting for quite some time.
And yeah, you're right. The chip situation is not going to affect the same way for everyone. For example, you can compare, the Wuling Hongguangs, right? They're going to get their volume no matter what. And then you have NIO, who announced a kind of a production stoppage. And then you have these foreign players in the joint ventures. SAIC, Volkswagen, and FAW Volkswagen, they were affected, I think, late last year to early this year. So it's not going to affect everybody the same way. Really, another driver is the whole EV credit system requirements. Really, that you have to meet this target, and that's going to drive both production and consumption. It's already a market-based now. The subsidy is no longer, I don't think it plays that much of a factor nowadays.
Well, the subsidies aren't as significant as they were, right? So I agree with you there, but a couple questions for you. And I have my opinion as well. Now, with those credits, the credit system where the automotive OEM, if you don't manufacture 10% of all vehicles to be NEVs, then you have to buy credits from somebody else or pay penalties. Do you think that's going to drive fleet sales, which typically does? And the second question, which doesn't have anything to do with it, but who do you see, if we get to 2.5 million units, and Tesla, BYD, and Wuling are currently 46% of all EV sales, who do you see stepping up? I think Tesla, because again, the Model Y is not fully ramped. So that's going to take significant share without question, I think, in the 300,000, 400,000 RMB. So one of the suggestions that was made to us, which made a lot of sense, so 300 RMB is about $45,000. So 400,000 RMB is about $60,000. So in the $40,000 to $60,000 range, I think the Model Y, because it's a crossover SUV, is going to be extremely popular towards Q3 and Q4 as production ramps completely. So what do you think about fleet vehicles taking up a lot of that 2.5 million volume that you're predicting, barring any supply issues? And who do you see stepping up outside of those three manufacturers?
Well, fleet sales, I'm willing to say that fleet sales will, just like subsidies are no longer a significant factor, fleet sales are also, their share of, all these NEVs sold will also decline. And now it's pretty much, majority is the private market. In terms of who's going to, take up, the share behind those top three, I gotta say, it's interesting to see what Volkswagen does. They're big, they're all in, and they have China-specific models and the way they play it, right? The ID4 has two different versions, and the ID6 is a China-specific model that's not launched anywhere else, and they have two different versions. I think the Chinese players are not, waiting around, right? The state-owned and as well as the smart EV startups. So, but, Tesla, here's the number for Tesla. They sold nearly, 35,000 in March. And they sold, the first 2 months was roughly that number. And Wuling is about 40,000 a month. So those will continue to, be a significant portion of the market. And I'm interested to see what the foreign joint ventures do, how well they do this year.
Yeah, I agree. With Volkswagen, who sold 3.5 million units last year, I believe, in China, what's a success for them? They need to sell a gazillion of these ID4s in order to maintain their capacity long term in China. And so it'll be interesting to see if they see any softness in demand for the ID4 in the short term, what types of things that they try to do? How do they incentivize the consumer? Do they just blitz the market with more marketing because it's such an important vehicle for them? That's going to be their volume play, right? And, to your point, maybe this is a great segue into the P5, right? I know that it's not shipping for a while, but we're talking sub 200,000 and we're talking specifically about the XPeng P5, which is a sedan that just launched 2 days ago that is going to have LiDAR as standard, and all these technological gadgets have been stuffed inside, and so at a sub 200,000 RMB price point, which is under $30,000, do we think, or do you think, Lei, that stands a chance to become a volume play for XPeng?
Yeah, speaking of P5, it's one of the bigger launches this week because of the LiDAR play, and it being, as I made an educated or wild but educated guess, that the way they will approach, they haven't announced the pricing yet. They will probably do this at the Shanghai Auto Show on Monday. I'm guessing this is going to be, they will have LiDAR versions, upper trims, probably somewhat above 200,000 RMB, and they will offer lower trims at sub 200,000 RMB. So this is a much bigger volume play for XPeng compared to the P7, which is kind of like a, more premium. But the interesting thing is what XPeng has to be careful is that when they launched the G3, they made a mistake on pricing that hurt their customers. It was 2 years ago. So I guess they will be careful with the pricing, but the selling point is right there. This is the first production smart EV with LiDAR. And they want to achieve city level, level 3 autonomous driving with their 3.5 pilot upgrade. So that's huge selling point. And right around the 200,000 RMB price point, I think it's huge. And you mentioned earlier about new models, dealership models. XPeng just signed a deal with one of the largest dealer groups, Zhongsheng Group, that they will invest and set up new point of sales for XPeng. So I thought that was interesting because now they're working with these traditional dealerships rather than, having their own direct sales model.
So the P5 and the P7, there's going to be a decent amount of overlap. And you had mentioned with the G3, they had kind of made a mistake on pricing. So they're walking a fine line here, a tightrope between the P5, unless it's most of the sales are going to be around the 200,000 RMB price point. At the high end, they're going to be overlapping with the low end P7. Okay, so there could be a decent amount of cannibalization there. And you would think they would have made a bit more separation. So I'm looking at maybe the P7 in 6-9 months time frame gets a bump in price just to separate it even further. And then the other thing too is, shameless plug, I'd spoken with Trevor Moss of the Wall Street Journal, and he wrote an article about the XPeng, and I'd said that XPeng is trying to become the smartest of EV makers in the world, and they've stuffed all this technology into the P5 and taken separately these, LiDAR and watching a movie or whatever, being able to do some of these things in the vehicle are kind of taken separately. They seem to be a bit cheesy, but taken all together, it really, really creates this separation and positioning for XPeng as the most technology embracing smart EV company in the world. Whether that translates into sales, significant sales, it's yet to be seen, because we do know that Chinese consumers love connected vehicles. They love, and their number one priority is always going to be safety. So the LiDAR should play into the ADAS systems and the safety aspects for the Chinese consumer. And the other thing is that the Chinese consumer post-90s is digitally native, right? So everything is going to be digital. That's their expectation of the new vehicles that they buy. But I wonder if outsourcing some of the sales to a third party, this dealership network, is actually going to play against the user experience or the sales experience, because they have to work very closely with these third-party dealers. And that's likely, they made that decision to join with this third-party dealership network because they wanted to increase volumes more quickly, right? And rather than opening retail stores, which can be time-consuming, they decided to partner so that they have access to a lot more dealerships across China. But, one of the best things I think that a lot of these smaller EV startups here in China have going for them is that these retail experiences seem to be better than the current dealership experience, right? Because Genesis now, Ford with the Mach-E have decided that they're going to separate selling certain products from the dealership process, from the traditional dealership process. So we should expect to see a lot more direct consumer business models and, the O2O where 40 hours of time is spent researching a vehicle prior to actually stepping into a dealership or a retail store. So I don't know if that plays well into XPeng's pre-sales capabilities.
Yeah, if you look at the launches this week, the Made in China Mustang Mach-E, the Zeekr 001, and the, obviously XPeng, but they're all basically, not copying, but emulating. Really, NIO is the benchmark here, the way they deal with, with their NIO houses, right? So Mach-E is going to have these special direct sale, experience centers. The Zeekr 001 is going to have these Zeekr centers. And I think NIO kind of set the benchmark. But going back to the LiDAR and USP for the P5, they are about to get a lot of competition from ArcFox and Huawei. Because ArcFox and Huawei, right, there was a very viral video of their autonomous driving Alpha S. And their claim is we are the benchmark of autonomous driving globally. Whereas XPeng said, we're going to be number one globally autonomous driving. So this is, this level of competition is really cutthroat. Nobody's going to be, easy going. You're always going to have some competition somewhere. So we'll see what happens because the Alpha S launches reveals tomorrow.
Yeah, so let me push back on one aspect. I think the retail thing is an Apple thing, and then Tesla kind of aped it, and then NIO took it a step further by adding the coffee and stuff like that, right? So I think NIO evolved it for the China market, and now we're seeing derivatives, probably not very good derivatives from some of these companies because, with NIO it kind of makes sense because they're trying to position themselves in the premium design-oriented market segment. But on this lower price level, if we're trying to move volume, does the retail model still make the same amount of sense, right? And if we're going to sell in volume, we probably have to manufacture and build a bit of inventory so that the lead times stay pretty short when purchasing their vehicles. And so I saw that video and it's actually pretty crazy, right? Because I think you get a better appreciation of the China roads when you see, and Will from China Driven had kind of mentioned it in a tweet that, these delivery guys on these mopeds just kind of swerve in front of you. And so I've been driving in Chinese roads and you've been driving on Chinese roads for years. You still never get used to it, right? Because if there's 2 meters of an opening, there will be a car that tries to squeeze in. And that's just how the Chinese roads and kind of the culture of the driving in China happens. And so the complexity is very high. But, to your point about this level 3, and my understanding of level 3 autonomous is when the liability goes from the automaker if there's an accident to the driver. And so when a Chinese manufacturer has a ton of confidence, and a ton of confidence means that the model is right, the machine learning algo is correct, number one. And then number two, they have to have a ton of data, right? A ton of data. And so one of the constraints of data is not having enough vehicles on the road to collect that data. And so if we look at XPeng, if we look at ArcFox, they have thousands and tens of thousands of cars, right? Tesla's about to have hundreds of thousands of cars. Now, their data situation and their hardware software stack situation, because they're an American company, is completely different than these Chinese companies. But if XPeng and ArcFox are going to be able to back up that claim of being globally the best autonomous driving system, or developing or having the best autonomous driving system in the world, they're going to need to sell a lot more cars, and they're going to need to sell them in places with four seasons, with snow, with rain, with hail, you name it. But I think the more realistic outlook is going to be that you're going to see ArcFox and you're going to see XPeng talk to Guangzhou government. ArcFox, I'm not even sure. You tell me where ArcFox is. They're going to have these small neighborhoods or these small cities or these small districts. They're going to geofence them and say, okay, between these times of days, you can use this level 3 autonomous or ADAS. Just to get the system out there. It's going to be very limited, and it's going to be in certain places where the brand is friendly with the local governments. What do you think about that?
Yeah, Tesla is very aggressive here in the US, right? With, I guess, 1,000 of their owners trying out the FSD beta, but they can't do anything in China yet. We accept the autopilot, whatever autopilot or a autopilot upgrade, as it is called, being used in China. But whereas the other, the startups, whether it's XPengs or even the Huawei's, they're much more, I guess, aggressive comparatively. I'll give you an anecdote of when you mentioned, living in Beijing, especially in the big cities. When I lived in Beijing, when I walk on the street or ride my mobike, I'm more scared of being hit by a Meituan, fast food delivery guy than being hit by a car. That was, by the looks of it, if they've solved this, part of the puzzle of a complicated road situation, then whatever's happening here is much more simpler, right, in the US. And also, there's another point maybe worth mentioning is this today also the EQS was announced. And Mercedes is very specific with L3. When they say L3, they say it has to be divided highways in heavy traffic below 60 kilometers an hour. They're very specific. And in China, you have, for example, today, your time, the WM Motor is launching the W6, which they've been marketed as the first driverless car. I mean, that's the way I perceive it, reading from the Chinese. 无人驾驶, the 量产, the first self-driving car, but it's actually automated valet parking capability. So there's huge, from the marketing side, there's a huge misconception how the customers perceive this.
Yeah, and I think WM is in partnership with Bosch on that parking assist. And the second thing, when we talk level 3, but they're limiting the speed and the situations that level 3 can be utilized or their system can be utilized, what we're talking about with the EQS is a similar situation to low-speed autonomous delivery vehicles, right? So the technology is currently already there, and it's being used by these autonomous delivery robots that we're starting to see pop up in the US, in Detroit, in Boston, in Pittsburgh, in San Francisco, and we're definitely seeing them here. So, again, it's a slow rollout because they still need to, I think the technology's there, like the LiDAR, the cutting edge LiDAR, but it's expensive. And the policies need to catch up. And I think we'll start to see that on a city to city basis here in China sooner than we will in the United States. But, I'm going to have a few calls next week with some technical folks. I think you might be jumping on one with me, Lei, to really get a better understanding of how to differentiate between what's being said and what's being proclaimed by each of these automakers and see what the real differences are besides more data versus less data, right? And looking at the sensor suite, right? Because one of the other charts that I saw that I noticed that someone asked me about was XPeng comparing their suite of hardware to a Model 3s. And it said something about 32 sensors versus 16 sensors on a Model 3. So, that simple chart implies that more sensors are better. But is it really? Because it might actually confuse the computer, the onboard machine learning computer. And so I want to get a much clearer picture and understanding of what's really important. What calculations and what decisions are being made in the edge computer in the trunk of the vehicle versus what's being shipped to the cloud, and how that whole process works in milliseconds, right? Because decisions are being made, but we're seeing it, on a mass scale now. So
yeah, and also speaking of the sensors and lidars in particular, the P5 and the ArcFox Alpha S, both of these cars have their lidars positioned on the bumpers. But here's the interesting thing. Their tactics for doing this are completely different. For P5, it's more of a aesthetics thing. Whereas for the ArcFox Alpha S, they have 3 lidars, 2 on the side of the bumper and 1 in the middle. And they said this is to have a kind of a 300-degree view. And P5, in their press conference, part of the reason put it in on a bumper is to save interior space, not having a extruding part on the top of the windshield, as some other people do. So, different tactics at play here. I'm not sure about, both will have to face issues of, collision damage. What happens there? But I just wanted to throw that point out,
I actually wanted to move it to the Ford Mach-E, since this is such a unique situation, right? It's an American car company that's decided to really, really put its most important vehicle in quite some time globally, right? So it's an important vehicle in the United States, and it's probably the most important vehicle for Ford Motor in China in probably forever. And so they've decided that they're going to manufacture it in Chongqing, and that BYD is going to supply the batteries, not the Blade batteries, but
the NCM A11 batteries,
yes,
which BYD never uses. Maybe Taylor can correct me if I'm wrong.
And then the other thing really quickly is that they've decided to partner with, or when we say partner, they've decided to pay NIO for the use of their supercharging stations, which to me is actually very prudent and very smart, because Ford was, I won't say on its last legs, but it was struggling here, and it has been struggling. Recently, due to COVID, the sales have increased, and it's been, to me, a management issue early and then a product issue later. And so we're starting to see them replenish some of that product pipeline in China, at least. And I believe that the Mach-E is going to see fairly brisk sales in China. So I'd love to hear what you think.
One of the pictures that I saw was interesting is whenever they have a press conference, you have these senior execs standing next to the car and they take a photo together, right? So standing next to Chen Anning, the CEO of Ford China, was, I forgot his name, but he's the president of FinDreams. FinDreams is the battery plant in Chongqing. So I thought that was very interesting to have, a BYD affiliated senior level guy standing next to a major Ford model launch. It so happens that they have the plant in Chongqing, and Chang'an Ford, the joint venture for Ford, is also in Chongqing, which is building the Mach-E. And I feel like Ford really lowered their kind of status on what they're trying to accomplish. The correct word probably is prudent or frugal. And that's why you sort of see their Mach-E prices was quite surprising to me. But obviously, one is square targeted against the Model Y, which is similarly priced, the slightly sub to around 300,000 RMB or the $40,000 range. And I compare the prices of the China-made Mach-E and the Mach-E here, and some versions are actually lower, a bit lower, based on a $1 to 6.5 exchange. So I think really, this is like you have to win on this first model, especially putting a Mustang, which is one of the biggest drivers for consumers in China because Mustang is relatively well-known brand or sub-brand of Ford in China. So I think they did everything right so far, but again, it comes down to the product.
I'd written that down. I was going to ask you about that. There's obviously not a history here, but the Mustang product is recognized in China and it's very well received. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah, there's a big following, and they have like Mustang festivals every year, fan festivals. The only thing I'll say though is the Chinese, they no longer use the Yema, which means wild horses in Chinese, because there's another company in China that has the same name. So they ended up just using the Mustang English name. So that's the only, caveat. But Mustang, there's a huge following.
How do you think it's going to do? Because I've seen that, some folks that have probably never stepped foot in China think that it's not going to do well or are fairly opinionated about what they think the Chinese market wants. I actually think it's going to do pretty well. I don't know currently what their sales expectations are. I would think they would fairly modest, but I think it's going to do pretty well here. I think it's a good looking car, and I think it's a decent alternative to a Model Y. So what do you think?
Well, deliveries won't start until Q4. So we'll probably get some more details as far as, order volume as the year goes on. But I think from a strategic point, even here in the US, right, choosing that Mustang name is important because of the fan base also in China. And making that, first BEV, really, putting that BEV on the Mustang name. And really having a local team in charge of, everything, the product planning, the sales and marketing, right? The guy who introduced the Mach-E at the press conference used to be a VP of NIO, and who was rumored to go into another company. I forgot which, but he denied the rumors. He's still there. He's the COO of, the BEV Ford China. They have a special project team. So he knows the NIO experience. So he's trying to replicate that to the Mach-E. So,
which again I don't think they have the same customers, right? So the one thing that we should see over the course of this year is Chinese companies, Chinese auto manufacturers really understanding or learning on the job what some of the traditional marketing aspects of vehicles are. Because in the past history, 30 years, there's generally just been a ton of growth in the automotive sector. So you haven't really needed to be that good at marketing, positioning, understanding customer needs, the 4 Ps. But if more than 3 automakers are going to command 50% of the market, let's say 4, because we're assuming VW will sell a decent volume of ID4s over the course of the next 12 or 18 months. And there are going to be more than 4, then a distinct understanding of the market, how you're positioned, what features you should emphasize, who your customers are, how to reach them, how to engage them, how to educate them, and how to keep them loyal and happy, right? Currently, Tesla is running into some challenges with that. I think part of it is growing pains, but the other part is, I just think they're probably a little bit of their hubris because they're kind of the only game in town currently still. But as competition increases significantly, will we see more customer-friendly overtures by Tesla? Hopefully, likely, right? Do you think that price is driven, the cheaper price is driven by the batteries from BYD?
Well, it has to be one of the reasons. And also, I think you mentioned the customer experience, right? There's one trend going on with whether it's the Chinese smart EV startups or these new higher-end brands coming out from the state-owned company is the CSOP, right? What's the acronym? The customer share, basically customers being a part of the entire process, even from the product itself. And this goes to Zeekr 01, which, the way the company is set up, right? The 51-49 joint venture. And then part of the 49, I think, is owned by GD Holding Group. And there's 4.9% shares that users can participate in. And then plus the other part of it is really the engagement, right? NIO has done it well with their single app based thing. Tesla does it, right? Everything from sales to service to you do it on app, and RFOC, right? Even Mustang, everybody's trying to replicate this being directly accessible. You can talk to the CEO right on the app and he'll respond to your questions, things like that, and making customers a part of your decision making, right? So, for example, Zeekr 01, the camouflaged car that was being shown around, one customer said, please make that. And the CEO said today, yeah, we'll make it. These type of things for the legacy OEMs are a bit more difficult to accept and change. Even, Volkswagen, right? They have their own app for everything.
It's Geely. I actually really like the Zeekr 001. I think it looks great. It has the same profile as the Taycan Cross Turismo. It's actually bigger than a Taycan, so it's pretty decent sized vehicle.
The interesting thing is they call it a mass market shooting brake EV in their press release. But in the press conference where you see on the PPT, it says it's a 豪华 luxury shooting brake EV. So I'm not sure if there is any miscommunication there, but priced also in the Mach-E range, right? The 300,000, sub 300,000, around 300,000, $40,000 range.
Which to me makes it premium, but it doesn't make it luxury. Clearly to me this week and this week, of all the announcement, the EQS is clearly a luxury vehicle. I don't know. You help me fill in the blanks. I don't know any vehicle that was launched this week that we can clearly state fills the luxury definition. Now, to me, the EQS design-wise looks okay. I think it's mama hoo-hoo. I think the physical interior is great. I think the IP and dashboard looks like Nintendo threw up on it. It looks like an arcade rather than $120,000 US vehicle or $90,000 US vehicle. I think they went way too far with that dash and IP, but what we'll start to see, I would think, next week are some more of these so-called true luxury vehicles that are going to be launching into the market. We'll see the Lyriq, which is an SUV, not a sedan, but Cadillac is obviously a luxury brand. And then, I take that back. We did see the Q4 e-tron, right? Which is more premium to me than luxury. But were there any other luxury vehicles? Were there any Chinese luxury vehicles that launched this week?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.